Develop Effectively Game Devs, Tony Chan here, and welcome to episode 60 of Game Dev Loadout, where I chat with the best people in our industry to learn how they got started, the obstacles they face, and the tools they use to reach success. Make sure you stay updated with new episodes every week by subscribing to the podcast. And now let's chat with today's featured guest, Deborah Henderson. Deborah, it's game time. Are you ready?
I am ready.
Yes. She is a cognitive psychologist who has worked in games for more than 6 years. She specializes in helping teams understand when they are delivering on their design visions or what is blocking players from getting to that vision. And now she currently works at Microsoft Studios User Research. So go ahead, Deborah, give us a bit about your personal life and how you got started in the game industry.
Sure. So where I actually came from was academia. So I went to college, got really into psychology, in particular into research psychology, so I decided to pursue a PhD in this. And I went off to Stanford, and I did that, and I got to the end of my PhD, and I thought, gosh, I really don't particularly want to go into academia. And this was sort of frustrating, because I wasn't really sure what anyone else did with a sort of research degree in psychology. And so I sort of looked around me, then I reached out to some of my alumni networks and things like that. And as it happened, somebody who I shared an alma mater with was at Microsoft doing research because he had gotten a PhD in psychology. And I said, oh, that's interesting. I spent a lot of my time playing games. Maybe this is a good match for me. And I reached out there, and it turned out to be just sort of a really, really great match for me. My PhD was looking at how people understand fiction and nonfiction. It wasn't on games. It was, in fact, on retelling of stories and things like that. But what was sort of lovely about this is that the games user research department at Xbox is large enough that they're used to sort of bringing in people who are great at designing research, but maybe don't necessarily have a lot of hands-on experience testing games. And then they bring us in and they learn from us what our sort of area of expertise is, and they give us all the training that we need for testing games. And I have been there now for, I think, 6.5 years. And it's been a while, I guess, and shipped a whole bunch of games, little bitty tiny ones, so Double Fine's Happy Action Theater or the original State of Decay, but also large ones, so most recently Quantum Break. And that's where I've been, and I've been having a great time.
How cool is that you're able to use your degree to video games? It's so cool. Like, can you expand upon your main area of expertise?
Sure. So mostly what I do in my day-to-day is I test games. So a developer will be working on a game, a designer will have a vision for how they want it to play, and what we'll do is we'll bring it into our labs, and we will have real gamers come in and play the games. And we'll figure out what's working and what's not working. And this is something that we do throughout the entire development process. We actually start even before a game exists sometimes, and we'll start either by actually sitting down and understanding the needs that users have. So if you say, I would like to build a game like this, and we will go and study a competitive game and figure out like what people like about it, but also what they're really struggling with and where the opportunities might be. But we also will study things like I've drawn out what I think maybe the flow of the choices will be for the user. And it'll just be sort of a paper prototype, and we'll run people through it and have them think aloud and sort of see whether or not the way that gamers are thinking about it is the same way that a developer is thinking about it. Because one of the profound challenges that designers face is that they are so deep into their own game, it can be hard to see how someone from the outside might perceive it. And so we do a lot of testing like that all the way up through development, where we start off with questions of sort of, is this the right thing to build? And then we move on to, can people just use this or understand it? And then we move into questions of like, is this fun? Is this engaging? Is this deeply moving?
Wow. So I did not know you can actually, I didn't even think about this. You test a game out before you even make a prototype. You test a game out on pieces of paper to a real gamer. That is really interesting. And that can actually save you a lot more time instead of like trying to create a prototype and showing it to the world.
Absolutely. So one of the methods that I have developed and has been really, really useful for a lot of games is a way to do that specifically with narrative, because obviously that was my background for my PhD. But it was something where when I came into look at how people were testing story, they had to wait until they had finished a cutscene. And cutscenes are stunningly expensive. They're one of the most expensive things that you build in a game. And so if you don't get that right, there's not a lot of wiggle room, right? It's incredibly expensive to redo things. And if people just can't follow what you're saying or don't understand your story, you end up in this problem where it's going to be astronomically expensive to actually fix it. And so the question for me was, well, can we pull this back and can we actually test this on paper? And indeed, because of a sort of, if you understand narrative, you understand that there's a difference between a way a story is told and the story itself. So a good example of this is actually the movie Memento. The facts and events of the story go in one order, but the movie, of course, goes in reverse. And so it's something where there's kind of a difference there. And what was nice about that is we figured out that we could basically get designers, and we looked at the design process that narrative designers use. And typically what they'll do is very early on, they will have written out the sort of major beats of the story. And we figured out that if we tested there, we could accurately identify problems that players would have later on once the assets were built. And we could correct them before the assets were built, which made it a lot easier for the team and a lot less expensive.
Wow, yeah, that's incredible. And by the way, Memento is an amazing movie by Christopher Nolan. So I definitely recommend checking that out. But yeah, you're saving a bunch of time, a bunch of money by prototyping the idea very early in the phase. I'm curious, how do you get real gamers? Like, you just go out to local communities and ask people to play, to check it out, or how does that work?
Yes and no. So essentially, we have a whole team that's devoted to this, and it's something where recruiting is a big challenge. But basically, what we do is we look for people who have played games that are similar to yours, or whatever game that we're going to be testing. So if you say, I am building a game that is half RTS, half action adventure, we will go and we will look for people who've played both of those genres, and we will bring them into our lab and have them play it. Because the expectation is, if they have mastered games that are akin to yours, they are the people who your game should speak to. And if they can't figure out just how to move their pieces or things like that, then you're in trouble. So we look for things like that. And what we do is basically we have a database where we keep people in. I know there's if you're interested, particularly if you're in the Seattle area, it's pretty easy to sign up if you just sort of Google for us. But we just keep a running database of people who play games, and that's how we recruit them.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. You want to test your game on people that's already into that genre. So yeah, that makes perfect sense. What are common mistakes do you think game developers make when playtesting their games to users?
So I think there's sort of two common mistakes that developers make. The first is that they intervene too much. So if you are a game developer, I think the hardest thing about running a study on a user, so you bring in somebody and you have them play your game, the impulse to correct what they're doing is just astronomical. It's really hard because people do these terrible things, right? They get horribly lost. And to be clear, this is true of designers who are absolutely brilliant and wonderful and have made a million brilliant games. But every single time you go in there, you have the opportunity to be surprised by your users. And it's very, very, very hard for developers, particularly if they're running their own studies, to step back and just watch things happen and then actually stop and figure out why they're happening. The other thing that can be a little bit hard is sometimes I think developers don't really know necessarily what to do with the data. And there again, there's sort of two types of mistakes. One is sort of frustrating, which is that they will cede their sort of design responsibilities to users. So when users come in and players come in and they talk about what's wrong with a game, they are talking about what they want. They're not necessarily talking about what they need. And in game development, it's always a sort of risk-reward balance. And just because somebody wants something, it doesn't mean it's appropriate to give it to them right at that moment. You might need to make them earn it, or you might say there's actually really good reasons to never, ever, ever include that in your game because it would throw off the entire balance of the game. And so it can be hard when designers look at users and just say, what should I do? What should I build? What should I make? Because then really you're not being a designer, you're asking your users to be a designer. The other thing that can happen is that sometimes designers look at players and they think, oh my goodness, they're playing entirely the wrong way. This is terrible. I need to stop them from doing that. And that can be really hard because essentially what happens is the game designer is treating the player as sort of a terrible input device for their own game. And what they're forgetting is that games don't live on screens, right? The experience of a game what is on the screen is very important to it, but a game really lives in the mind of the player. And it's important to give players the freedom to behave naturally. And I'm not saying that you can't sort of extinguish behaviors. It's just you can't do that solely by taking away the freedom of choice, because then it's not actually a game. It's just a series of requirements that some designer has given a player to execute again.
So you're making a lot of great points that I just never thought about. So like you said, the users give a feedback, and sometimes it's not necessarily something you have to change or want to change. Like, how do you pick and choose which feedback to really take into consideration and make a change?
So we generally do a risk analysis on all of the feedback. So if this is something that stops the player from getting into the game, that's super important. And that's super important even if you run 100 people and only one person's if they can't start the game, this is a problem. And so you need to sort of, if you're really, really, really strongly blocking somebody, that becomes just really, really, really high risk. The other thing that is potentially very, very high risk is something that's sort of known as sort of a chronic stressor. So something where it's small, but it just happens over and over and over and over and over again. And it's going to have an additive effect across everybody. A great example of this is when checkpoints are placed before a cutscene. And so every time you die, you have to rewatch this, or they're placed far enough back that you have to walk for just a tiny amount of time, but it's right in front of a really difficult fight. And you have this moment of just and now I have to rewalk to get back to the fight, right? These are little things that they seem so small, but they grind away at the player, and they really grind away the experience. And so, frequently checkpoints is one of the places where it's very easy to get very easy fixes, because you just move them forward ahead of things and actually restart players where they need to be. And you get rid of this kind of problem of retraversal.
I absolutely hate cutscenes you can't skip. And I see what you mean. Like Dark Souls, I guess, is a great example, because you're dying and starting all the way back from the checkpoint, and you have to fight all these monsters again. And I think that's what turns a lot of people off, but also a lot of people love that as well for some reason. So I definitely see what you mean. And now let's take this on a personal level. So you've been in the game industry for more than 6 years now. Like, what was the worst moment of your career? That one moment that's still vivid in your mind. Be very detailed and tell us that personal story.
So I don't want to really out anybody on this. So one of my with user research. So my job, a lot of my job, is basically giving bad news, right? And what's interesting about that is the challenge is not in delivering bad news. It's in understanding what someone's going to do with it. And so for me, some of the worst moments are when I have accidentally essentially made a game experience much worse because a designer has looked at my feedback and acted on it, but in an incredibly negative way. And typically this falls into that category of them looking at the user and saying, "You're just playing it wrong. Therefore, I'm going to prevent you from doing what you're doing, and I'm not going to take the time to actually understand the experience and make things better." That can be really hard. The other thing that can be incredibly, incredibly hard is when you are very close to a deadline and things just aren't working. They aren't coming together, and everybody is working so incredibly, incredibly hard, and they want so much for this to work. And one of the sort of very difficult things about experience is that you can make 1,000 little changes and do just an astronomical amount of work, and players won't necessarily give you credit for it because you're doing things like getting rid of bugs, and they just assume those aren't going to be there to begin with, right? And they don't give you credit or pay you compliments or say, "Oh yes, this is a lot more fun," because all you've done essentially is brought the game up to the expectation that they normally had. And that can be incredibly challenging. It can be hard to predict what is the magic thing that's going to make something fun. All you can do is say, here are the things that are currently stopping people from having fun. Let's just work through them and get rid of them and see where we're at and see if we've actually made this thing fun. And that can be just an incredibly challenging conversation to have with people because they have devoted their lives. Oftentimes they have significant sort of financial investment, or it's their career, or, really, really important things. And on top of it, they're going to have devoted sort of their mind and their dreams to something for just years. And you're just basically telling them it's not there and I'm not sure it's going to get there. And that can be really, really, really challenging.
Oh man, so yeah, two big points. What do you want to tell game devs that like they don't want to listen to the users? Like they let their, I guess, a love for the game get in, block their vision of making the game better for the users. Like, what can you tell game devs to like step away from the project, listen, and see how the users react and take that feedback as a positive thing?
I think just the basic idea, and I think this resonates with a lot of game designers, which is that when you're building a game, you're building the game for someone else, right? You're not actually building it for yourself. I think game design is just a naturally empathetic activity. I think it is something that it is an experience that you are giving someone else. And I think most game designers that I've worked with agree with that, right? Their dream is to build an amazing experience and give it to someone else. And sometimes you can get in your own way with that. And oftentimes the other thing to remember is that the changes people need are not changes to your overall vision, but they just need to better understand it. Like the most frequent problems that we run into are ones where players are just thinking about things differently than game designers. It's not that the mechanic is broken, or it's not like the overall goal is a bad one. It's just they kind of miss the on-ramp to that experience, and we just need to get people there.
Yeah, like you touched upon, we are essentially making a game for the people. You know, we're making games because we love games, and we want other people to enjoy the games we're creating. So, yeah, in the end, it's for them. And the second point you touched upon was like the crunch time of releasing a game, and all this bad stories with crunch time. Like, what could game devs do? Like, should we communicate more with the players to keep them up to date about the progress of the game and like the issues that game devs are having before releasing the game?
I know that certainly communities love transparency, and I think it's also something where there is just a need for recognition that you are going to work on this game until it's done, right? And that it is going to be hard, and you are going to continue to work on things, and you're going to wait until it is a good experience. And I know it's so challenging, particularly if people think that something is coming out at a particular date for a player to learn that no, actually you can't have this wonderful thing you're looking forward to now. But almost every time a game has been pushed out, it makes the game better. And I think just helping people understand that is really important. And it also helps if you don't accidentally promise the wrong date. So I recommend trying to hold off on that until you're relatively confident in that. But predicting schedule is something that is just can be very, 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 very difficult because things emerge and things surprise you, and game development is something that it's not just something that you sort of make a plan and do. You have to stop and figure out what the experience is that you're building and then iterate on it.
Oh man, yeah. Be transparent. You know, let the audience know what you're doing, the progress of the game, and do not overpromise until, like you say, you're confident that you will be able to deliver on that promise. Now that you're more experienced and better, like, what do you think was the greatest idea you had to date in trying to understand players and getting that user experience?
Gosh, I don't know about that one. I mean, part of it is that part of why my job is so sort of delightful for me is that I'm always surprised by the things that come through my lab. I don't think I've ever run a study where something didn't surprise me. And that for me is a mark of just sort of good research. I think probably the thing that was most sort of surprising to me moving from academia into this kind of applied research is how many of the ideas that are foundational to research are, I think, better embraced by industry. So I'll give you an example of it. There's a basic idea in science that you have a hypothesis and you test against it. In academia, the way that we sort of ensure the quality of the tests against that is through peer review. So I have an idea, I say, here's my hypothesis, I design a test, and I test against it. And then I give that work to somebody else to say, did I do a good job testing it? And this works to a certain degree, but it also has some challenges because, of course, you get people who are in power and everybody just sort of agrees with them. And you get there's a strong motivation to prove yourself right, which isn't necessarily the best way to do science. In applied research, and in particular in games user research, the person who develops the theory is actually the designer. And that gives a beautiful separation between the researcher and the hypothesis. So I am essentially, I mean, this is a terrible way to think about it, but every time I go into the lab to prove a designer wrong. And I do it as fair a way as I possibly can, because of course, if he's right, that's awesome. And, if she's come up with this like brilliant idea and it works and it's a total surprise, that's great. And we definitely want to document it. But a lot of the time what I'm doing is I'm walking into the lab to say, no, this isn't going to work. And I'm going to show you all the ways it's not going to work. And then you are going to be better because your hypothesis is going to be able to improve because of that. And just recognizing that and understanding that for me was just a really deep and meaningful shift in terms of the way that I think about the work that I do.
Oh man, I just can't imagine. It must be hard for you to like go to the game designers to say, "Hey, we got to change this." Based on our research, we have to do this, we have to do that. I just can't imagine their reaction. But yeah, what you're doing essentially is helping the overall game to become better. So that's awesome. Like, what have you changed your mind about in the last few years, and why? Like, is there something, I guess, a concept maybe, or something that you just change your mind about?
It's hard to know that I've necessarily changed my mind about something, in part because I really try not to have sort of holistic views of things. I mean, one of the things that is really lovely about the game industry is that the experiences that we provide people are so varied. And frequently what my job is to do is to sort of maximize the very narrow experience that people are designing for, right? If you're designing a gardening game, that's very different than if you're designing a first-person shooter, even if you are essentially running around with some of the same mechanics because you have a gun that sprays, plant seeds and then waters things or something like that, right? The idea becomes very important. And I think one of the things that I have moved towards is really valuing intentionality much more than I did originally. So when I came in, I worried a lot about the mechanics. Did they work? Did they feel good? When you were in combat, did it really feel like you were hitting somebody or things like that? And increasingly, I've been impressed by games that have a central idea and they just cleave to it very, 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 very strongly. And part of why I like that is just because, again, as a cognitive psychologist, I look at that and I think, yes, of course, you have a strong framing here. And then the player, everything they experience, they can map it back to this central idea. And that becomes really important to this experience. And what's interesting about that is that's so separate from the idea of a game mechanic. I mean, that is something that is universal in art, I would argue. Whether you're looking at sort of Picasso's Guernica or whether you're looking at a book that's exploring a central idea or theme. Increasingly, I think that games that can embrace those sorts of things do really, really well and can cover up some maybe less graceful mechanics or less beautiful art or things like that.
Is there like a particular game that matches what you say best? Like, what's a game?
So, I mean, I think you can see this a lot in some of the indie games. I think probably Papers, Please is one of the strongest examples of this, where it's not something where you look at it. I mean, it definitely has an art style and all that kind of thing. But when you look at it, it's really exploring one central idea. And everything comes back to this kind of tension that it's building. And from the way that the save system works, from the just incredible difficulty ramp that it has, it becomes a much more powerful experience because of that.
Interesting. Yeah. Everything's like centralized in that one idea, like that core vision of the game. Awesome. Personally, like, what do you think was the best investment you've made? And it can be investment of money, time, or energy. And how did you decide to make that investment?
So I think the best investment I've made is in education. It's something where I think one of the things that distinguishes really good researchers from people who are maybe not as great is that there's a difference between somebody who can execute research and somebody who can design research. And I think actually coming out, getting the PhD, really putting the time in to understand research well enough so that if anybody gives me a problem about humans, I should be able to design a study against it to figure out an answer to that. Now, it might take me a very long time or be stunningly expensive, which is a risk, but at least from a research design perspective, that is really empowering. It means that I have the freedom to be surprised by the goals. It means that I have the freedom to think about things in a way that's very sort of specific to an experience. And then I can test against that very, very specific hypothesis. I don't just go out and run a usability with the right number of people because I've read a paper that said this is the right number of people. I can stop and I can understand and I can figure out how to really sort of design the best research to test the question at hand.
Yeah, it takes a lot of research to understand players. And I'm curious, when you're doing testing, like, how long does testing last? I know it varies between different games, but is there like a certain time limit that you should test a user experience on your particular game?
So we test throughout development, and we test very early and we test very, very, very late. It's not really, there's not so much a timing thing. It's more a matter of what exactly do you have currently and what should we test, right? So essentially what we do is we try to find that moment when design is feeling pretty good about an idea, but hasn't committed to it so much that they can't change it. And in that moment, you want to test that idea and say, all right, we think we've got a solid idea here. Let's put it in front of users and just make sure that the way that they are thinking about it and the way that we're thinking about it align. And if they do, awesome, this is great. And if they don't, then maybe we should stop and think about that and either embrace the ideas that the users are talking about or find a way to make clear that those aren't the right match here.
Gotcha. Okay, that's awesome. But now, with the video game industry booming now, what are you most excited about today?
So I think that I am most excited by just the sheer number of people who can make games at the moment. I think the barrier to entry for sort of game development has gotten a lot lower, and it's let a lot of people in who wouldn't necessarily have been able to sort of be designers in the past, right? It used to be a lot more difficult to sort of build a game. And I think I am most excited by just that sheer variety. I know it comes with the downsides because it's sort of hard to tell what's shovelware sometimes and what's a real thing. But I'm just excited about that because I think the vibrancy and just sort of the breadth of thought is becoming much better and sort of richer and has the opportunity to really sort of surprise in a much more interesting way.
Yeah, there's so many tools people could use now. And the latest indie game that I played was Abzu, which is like an underwater, visually beautiful looking game. And it's just absolutely amazing by indie company. I'm curious, like, what are your current favorite games you're playing right now?
Gosh, I don't know if I have a current favorite. I mean, I play a lot of Civilization because I play a lot of Civilization. That's just one of the things that I do. I tend to really enjoy and look for kind of novel experiences. But I also really, I really like those games that sort of commit to an idea and go through it. So I recently played through Swapper and really liked it because I thought it was a lovely, interesting sort of time swapping mechanic or body swapping mechanic that really just worked very well. I do like a lot of the kind of puzzle games and things like that. I'm less into just simply games because they are astoundingly high definition in any way. So being AAA is interesting, but it's not necessarily enough to make me love a game. And I basically love any game that I can play with my husband. So I enjoy games I enjoy games with couch co-op. So we've played through just a ton of games. I think we loved Kalimba. We more recently have been playing Overcooked and things like that. And just couch co-op for me tends to make a game really great.
He is a lucky man because I can't get my wife to co-op me with any game.
We have a pretty good time together. We when we were first dating, we were playing World of Warcraft together, and that was definitely a bonding experience for us.
Oh man, that's so cute. Awesome. The show isn't over yet, Game Dev. We have reached a crunch time, that phase that is dreaded, but we are here to overcome it. Basically, Deborah, I will ask you a quick questions, and you'll be giving us a ton of valuable information in return. Are you ready to crush it and release the show?
Absolutely.
Yes. What was holding you back from joining the game industry?
Just the fact that I didn't realize that I could join the game industry. I had no idea that there was a job out there that was suited to my talents and that would embrace me.
I'm curious, is there to get into, so people that are probably have the same background as you, is it really hard to get into the game industry with your background, or what should they do, I guess, to try to join the game industry?
So I think the best thing for them to do is probably to join the GER-SIG, which is the IDGA group. You can find it on LinkedIn, and they run every time GDC comes around, they run a summit, and you can go there and you can meet people and find mentors and make connections and just sort of learn a little bit about whether or not you think this is actually gonna work for you, and then you'll also be able to figure out where you should be tracking for jobs and things like that.
Ooh, definitely. Link that up. What's a personal habit that contributes to your success?
So I think the continually asking other people to review my work and tell me all the ways that I'm wrong is one of the ways I always get better at what I'm doing. So asking for feedback.
Asking for feedback, even though it might be harsh, you have to know what people think.
You have to know, and on top of it, you've got to make sure that when you are saying something, other people read not just your words, but what you are intending to say.
Ooh, yeah, that's a good one. What's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
I think the best piece of advice I've ever received was to sit back and watch first, and to assume always, I mean, this is a sort of common one, but to just always try to assume best intents. Sometimes it can be hard to understand why people are doing things, but if you can step back and try to figure out, sort of assuming this person has the best of intents, what are they trying to accomplish? That helps you both persuade them when they're not maybe doing the right thing, but also it helps you learn from them and identify where you maybe are falling behind their thinking.
Yes, watch and listen first. How has a failure set you up for later success?
So when data surprises you, you are becoming smarter. And that is a core principle. Being wrong is awful in the moment, but it is the only surefire way to make yourself smarter the next time around.
Ooh, I like that. What resources should we game devs use?
I think that you should use players as a resource. So I think that you should find strangers who you have never met and who have no obligation to be nice to you. And I think that you should put your game in front of them. And I think you should just watch them play and ask them to tell you what they're thinking about.
Now, this next question is a bit of a doozy, so take your time if you need to. Imagine you woke up the next morning in a brand new world and you knew no one. You still have all the experience and knowledge you currently have today. Your food and shelter is taken care of and you have a laptop. What would you do step by step on the path to become a great game developer?
So that one's hard for me, in part because I never work separately. I only ever work in teams because I'm always in response to a designer. So I think the first thing I would do is I would work on my thinking as a researcher. So I would look at studies and I would break them down, not in terms of like how they interpreted their results, but in terms of how they designed the studies. And I would do that to sort of improve my mastery of thinking and just sort of the number of things that I could solve. And then I think the next thing I would do is I would probably use sort of that process to identify people I could learn from and try to find mentorship. Because mentorship is just incredibly valuable. One of the things that's unusual about my field is that a lot of it is done essentially through apprenticeship. And I say that may only be unusual because I'm coming out of academia, but there's not a sort of formal training in a lot of ways. Or if there is, it's a training that only trains you how to execute studies. It's not something that trains you how to sort of think about and design studies. And so I would find a mentor. And then I would start offering to help people. And I would reach out to people and I would say, you know, can I help you with your game? And I would try to do that sort of a thing and really, really deeply understand it. Assuming I was trying to be a researcher. If I was trying to be a game designer, I would think of a really cool idea and just start trying to build things out for it and just see what ideas I think worked and what didn't.
So in terms of the mentorship, is it a good idea to pay for mentorship, like to pay someone to mentor you? Is that a good idea? Because I've been trying to find like a great mentor that for podcasting. Is paying for a mentor a good idea?
So I don't know anybody within my field who has paid for a mentor. Obviously, I can't speak to podcasting. That's a different field. But for the most part, that isn't something that I've known people to do. Instead, again, this is one of the reasons why things like the GER-SIG is very useful for people coming in, because they arrange mentorship circles and things like that. And so you can find people who are willing to volunteer to be a mentor. And then on top of that, you can find talks and presentations. So for instance, at the last GER Summit, I went and presented all on Quantum Break and a whole bunch of methods that I used and things like that. And I believe they've posted that talk online. And, there's lots and lots of resources that are out there to sort of help you self-educate and to make the right connections.
Yeah, I'm going to the Austin Game Conference in September. Oh, this month actually. Yeah, so definitely gonna network with people, build up that meaningful relationship, and just learn, start doing things. So, Deborah, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. You share your journey with us, and for that, we are truly grateful. And we will catch you next time.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me, and best of luck.
Thank you, Game Devs, for listening. And remember that knowledge is only potential power. Execution is the game. Go check out my website at gamedevloadout.com for all the show notes. If you want to listen to more inspiring stories and help the show grow, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and share it with your fellow colleagues. In the next episode, I interview Michael Shurix at a Bright Skull Entertainment Group, and we talk about how to do great voice performance. So until then, keep on making great games, and I'll catch you on the next episode. Bye.